Did a presentation on the Portsmouth branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad, which will be in this presentation a little bit as well, but I wanted to kind of expand the scope a little further beyond that specific line itself and talk a little bit about Portsmouth Railroad scene as a whole. Portsmouth, of course, is New Hampshire's only viable seaport, and because of that, it was a very important place for commerce and business, for ships and also for railroads as well. And when the Boston and Maine Railroad started to expand its business in New Hampshire, and the predecessor railroads that contributed to the Boston and Maine system map as well, Portsmouth is a very important location for all of that. So we're going to be taking a bit of a traveling trip around Portsmouth and looking at various locations in the city. It's going to be a very photo-heavy presentation, so we're going to try to stray a little bit away from the nitty-gritty topics concerning like engineering and things like that, and just kind of look at the images itself and dive into those as well. So we'll go ahead and dive right into a map of Portsmouth's railroad scene at the height when the railroad mileage in New Hampshire was at its peak. And you can see the various railroad lines which came in and out of the seaport city here. In red, that's the Eastern Route Main Line. That was built by the Eastern Railroad and eventually became controlled by the Boston and Maine. The Eastern Route was the #1 artery in and out of Portsmouth. It started in Boston, headed up the North Shore and crossed into New Hampshire in the Newburyport and Salisbury area. Continued up through Hampton into Portsmouth, crossed the Piscataqua River into Kittery, and then ran up by way of Berwick and Biddeford into Portland. There was also the Portsmouth branch of the Boston and Maine, which had started life as the Concord and Portsmouth Railroad. You can see that in orange down to the south of the map. That diverged from the Eastern Route Main Line and ran off towards Rockingham Junction at the Newmarket and Newfields border, then continued westward towards Manchester to Concord. To the top, you can see in blue the Dover and Portsmouth Railroad, which was a link between those two cities. And up in the top right, you can see the York Harbor and Beach Railroad, which of course at one point went all the way to York Beach. Eventually became a spur serving some customers in Kittery and the Navy Yard as well. The sort of epicenter of railroad activity in Portsmouth was, of course, Portsmouth Yard. It's a large plot of land along North Mill Pond, and this is where you found the freight yards, the passenger yards, the engine servicing facility, and Portsmouth Station as well. This is an engineering map from 1927. I believe it kind of shows you some of the railroad track and layout there along North Mill Pond, the engine facility, roundhouse, and turntable, just demolished this year, and some of the other tracks that were important for the Boston and Maine's operations in Portsmouth. This is a view probably in the 1920s or 1930s showing the yard in Portsmouth, and you can just see from this image how important the infrastructure was to the railroad operation in Portsmouth. You can see track and signals, passenger coaches laying over in the passenger yard, freight depot to the left, and associated tracks for loading and unloading of freight and goods in Portsmouth. Portsmouth's importance to the railroad has to be identified by looking at it being the only deep water port in New Hampshire. And of course, this made it extremely important to be able to have efficient transportation from the ocean to the rail and then inland as well. And so when the railroads first arrived in New Hampshire in the 1830s and 1840s, Portsmouth became an important location for transporting those goods inland from the seacoast and vice versa. This is a really neat shot taken in the late 1940s. 1949, I believe. This is a railroad enthusiast trip which stopped in Portsmouth. And it's kind of a neat shot because, again, you can see the various pieces and bits of infrastructure that were vital to the everyday operation of the railroad in Portsmouth. That structure to the left is a standpipe for watering steam locomotives. Of course, in the late 1940s, steam locomotives still made up a large portion of the power on trains running on the Boston and Maine Railroad. The thing that I love about this picture, though, is that you can definitely tell this was a time when insurance and that sort of thing wasn't quite as important. Because the photographers are taking every opportunity they can take to get a perfect vantage point for their photographs. And the really nice thing about these enthusiast fan trips is it gave us the opportunity, especially after World War II, to see photographs of the railroad, and we have a lot of documentation of the railroad because of these fan trips. Gentleman to the far right here with the glasses is Arnold Wilder. He was a well-known railroad enthusiast and photographer, and he actually contributed a lot of photos to the Boston and Maine Historical Society archive. Another really cool shot here, this is probably early 1950s, late 1940s, given the diesel locomotive you can see in center, which is switching some passenger cars. Portsmouth saw upwards of 12 passenger trains every day at its height of rail traffic, and you can can definitely see that on display here with the passenger yard to the left. You can also see on the far right some tanker cars, and the tanker cars is something we're going to talk about a little bit more as we get through this presentation. Fuel oil, which came in by ship, was an extremely important commodity for the Boston and Maine Railroad. These tanker cars held something called bunker C fuel oil, which was a hot commodity, literally. It was shipped hot and had to be kept hot to keep its viscosity. And so bunker C fuel oil came in by ship to Portsmouth and then traveled on the various lines out of Portsmouth to places like paper mills and fuel distributors throughout New Hampshire. It was an extremely important commodity from the 1950s onwards. Gorgeous wintertime shot here of a passenger train. This is probably an eastern route passenger train from Portland to Boston, making a station stop at Portsmouth. You can see the standpipe there for watering the steam locomotive. Tank in the far back would have been used to store the water for that standpipe, probably drawn out of North Mill Pond. And some of the signals here on display, these are CTC, centralized traffic control light signals, which would have been installed probably about 1944 onwards. Of course, Portsmouth had an engine servicing facility where the locomotives would have been serviced in between runs. This is an Atlantic type steam locomotive. You can tell that because the wheel arrangement, there are 4 small wheels in the front, 4 large wheels in the center, and 2 large wheels under the cab, so it's a 442 Atlantic type engine being watered at the engine facility. This is a gorgeous shot. I believe this was taken by Al Hale. He was a very prominent photographer based out of Beverly, Massachusetts. This is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive leaving Portsmouth. You can tell on the rear of the train there's quite a number of tanker cars, which means this is probably the Portsmouth branch freight, which is going to run to Rockingham Junction and then onwards towards Manchester. Kind of the cool thing about this shot too is if you look 2 cars back from the locomotive tender, you can see a boat on a flat car. It's kind of a neat shot. The mainstay of the passenger train traffic through Portsmouth was hauled by Pacific type steam locomotives. So this is a 462 Pacific type engine. The eastern route of the Boston, Maine did have some weight restrictions on the various types of engines which could operate over it. And I believe the P2s were some of the larger locomotives allowed to operate on the eastern route. And so you saw a lot of those specific types of engines. But if you had gotten on a passenger train in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it probably would have been hauled by a P2 Pacific out of Portsmouth. And as a matter of fact, as you'll see later in the presentation, there still is a P2 Pacific in Portsmouth, but that's a different story we'll get into. Another consolidation on a local freight. This is probably the local freight coming back from Manchester and Portsmouth Yard. Pretty small run on this day. Interestingly enough, if you look at the front of the locomotives, you can see white flags, and this is not a locomotive that's surrendering. The white flags indicate it's an extra move, which means that this was not a train that was in a regular timetable. Most local freights on the Boston, Maine were not in regular timetables, and so they flew white flags to signify that they were extra trains. Another cool shot. This is about the same location as the freight that we saw earlier with the consolidation. Once again, this is probably the Manchester local freight getting ready to leave Portsmouth. You can see to the left just the corner of the machine shop, which was part of the engine facility down by North Mill Pond. The passenger station in Portsmouth, particularly the one that you'll see in this presentation, was opened in November 1949. It was sort of a rebuild of the station that had been there for about 50 years at that point in time. The railroad center was kind of the focal point of railroad activity in most places. Portsmouth was certainly no exception. At one point in time, you could get on the train at Portsmouth Station and travel in a variety of different directions. This point in time, probably about 1954, 1955, you could only go to Manchester on the Portsmouth branch, Portland, or Boston. In addition to being kind of the center of railroad traffic in these towns and cities, the railroad station was also the location where other things could be done. You could get on a bus to go to various locations. Sometimes railroad stations had grocery stores and barbers located inside them. Sometimes they had restaurants. And an interesting bit of history that I like to talk about is the Railroad Express Agency, which was your very first example of home delivery that you ever had in the United States. And so basically, when a train would come into a town or city, they would unload what was known as less than carload freight. So if you're at home and you want a new garden hose, you can go down to the railroad station and order one from a catalog. And they place the order with the company that manufactures garden hoses. Then in a couple weeks, you get your garden hose on a box cart. They take it and load it into a delivery truck and then deliver it to your home from the railroad station by the Railroad Express Agency. And the Railroad Express Agency eventually directly becomes FedEx. And so that's where home delivery sort of comes from. Has its basis with the railroad. Another gorgeous color shot of Portsmouth Station here.
Can you tell us where that was?
They would have been right down by where the bank and the parking garage are today. Down right where
Maplewood
the
Avenue now crosses. Maplewood Avenue used to come into town, and this has got to the tracks that turn hard left to tie into Bond Street, and then Bond Street was the main road into town. And when they did the urban renewal at North End, they extended Maplewood Avenue, it comes straight into town and meet Middle Street.
People would run to the far side of that building.
Yeah, exactly right. Yep. Another nice shot showing the station sign here. Again, probably mid-1950s when this was taken. After the steam locomotives started to disappear on the Boston and Maine in the early 1950s, they were replaced by diesel locomotives, which had started to be introduced in the 1930s. And those hauled passenger trains for about 10, 12 years. Then the Boston and Maine invested in Budd rail diesel cars, which you can see here. This was a brand new invention about 1950, 1952. And the RDC was literally a way to put all your eggs into one basket. And so you didn't have to have a locomotive hauling passenger cars anymore, because these passenger cars are self-propelled. They have an engine underneath the car and a control section at either end of the car, and so you can basically run your passenger car all by itself. And they were great because if you had a small amount of passengers, you could run one RDC, or you could connect them up with 2, 3, 4, 5, as many as you needed. This is pretty early on too, because eventually the Boston and Maine logo would be added to the ends of the RDC cars. So this is 1952. This is right after the RDCs were delivered on the Eastern Route passenger train at Portsmouth Station. And this is the very last day of passenger service in and out of Portsmouth. You can see eventually the 1950s era logo was added to the ends of the RDC, and they haven't been washed in a while. Interesting story about this last day of service. This photo was taken by Richard Sanborn of Epping, New Hampshire. He was a rail historian and photographer, very well-known photographer. And he took this shot specifically of train number 232, which shortly will depart for Boston on its last run from Portsmouth. Later on in the day, train number 242 at 6:55 p.m. will be the last train to ever leave Portsmouth carrying regular passengers, but it left too late in the day to be photographed in sunlight. And so this is the very last daylight shot we have of a passenger train in Portsmouth. As we said earlier, the Portsmouth Depot, which with its quintessential New England styling and simple lines, opened in November 1949 as a rebuild of a predecessor building which had been on the site for half a century. Its dimensions were 60 feet by 61 feet on the exterior, so almost a complete square. Inside were a large waiting room, ticket office, conductor's office, an Armstrong Company restaurant, bus dispatcher's office, and restrooms. The high ceiling of the single-story building gave the waiting room the feeling of an old New England meeting house. Portsmouth Station was there into the 1960s. I'm not sure exactly when it was demolished. Somebody here might know, but it didn't last.
1970.
1970, thank you. So this is 1965 when this was taken, so only 5 years after the end of passenger trains in Portsmouth, they tore the station down. And here you can see that run heading out on the eastern route departing Portsmouth. You can see the yard office, that red building to the left. And heading off, this particular area we're in right now is where they just built those brand new apartment condominiums. So this is right alongside the eastern route in Portsmouth. Now we get into a little bit about Portsmouth Engine Facility, or the roundhouse and turntable. This is an early shot, probably in the 1880s, of various steam locomotives at the roundhouse in Portsmouth. You can see that the roundhouse was built in 1872 from the date at the top. And it was quite a bit larger at one point, although eventually it was brought down to a smaller size. They removed a lot of the stalls. This is probably the 1920s or 30s. This is an American type 440 steam locomotive inside. the engine house, kind of a rare shot inside the roundhouse in Portsmouth. Interesting mishap. I scanned these negatives from the official Boston and Maine Railroad Company negatives, which we have in the archives at our Historical Society. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. It's a boom truck that looked like it might have been used to temporarily turn the turntable, and that's a GP7 diesel locomotive right alongside it. And so it looks like the engine might have missed the turntable and gone into the pit. Kind of an interesting shot. I don't believe there were any injuries here, but kind of a mess. Yeah, you can see the engine didn't quite line up with the turntable and just kind of went right into the side of it. The engine house, as you can see here, in 1954 shrank considerably from that earlier photo. This is a GP7 diesel locomotive on the turntable. These were bought for passenger service by the Boston and Maine, but once they bought those RDC rail cars, they took all the GP7s and put them into freight service. And so you can see a Jeep here on the turntable. Another shot of the engine house in the 1960s, 1970s. Maintenance starting to go by the wayside a little bit. The Boston and Maine went bankrupt in 1970, and so they couldn't maintain their structures and facilities quite to the specs that they could in earlier times. But the Boston and Maine kept a switcher locomotive in Portsmouth to serve all the industries in the town, and so you can see the switcher there in the yard. Gonna have an interesting before and after shot here. This is probably the late 1940s, early 1950s of a 280 consolidation on the turntable at the engine facility. This is probably going to be used to haul the daily freight from Portsmouth to Manchester. And this is the engine facility as it looked earlier, I believe last year or earlier this year. The turntable was still there. The engine house had started to collapse in on itself. And they recently just demolished the entire facility, entire structure. I think they're going to put more of the apartment buildings there. But interestingly enough, it was here until just a couple months ago.
Where is that?
This is right down along Mill Pond. They're putting up a whole bunch of condos and stuff like that across the railroad tracks. But yeah, the whole area is pretty much being redeveloped now, but it's very fascinating to see how much of that land was needed when the trains were still operating. As we said earlier, bunker sea fuel oil was an important commodity for the railroad. This is one of those tank cars that would have hauled it from Portsmouth inland. And another kind of neat shot of all those tankers in the yard. You can see the yard office there. And I like this shot because you can see the towers of the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge off to the left. This kind of gives you an idea of where that would be. You have the pond to the left, to the right. There's a lot of houses and condos there today. And then looking down towards the railroad crossing in the center of town. Really cool shot that comes out of the PR files of the Boston and Maine. George Hill was the official photographer for the Boston and Maine. He went around taking pictures for the company magazine. This is the yard foreman in Portsmouth. And on the back of a boxcar. Same person, and you can see the towers from the bridge in the background as well. So identifiably instantly as Portsmouth, which is super cool. Oftentimes the yard crews would write in chalk where the car was destined, and so sometimes you can make out specifically where this car is going or coming from. I don't believe you can make that out in this one, but certain cars you can tell. It's kind of neat. More recent shot, taken probably in the 1990s of a yard in Portsmouth. Boston, Maine was bought out in 1983 by Guilford Transportation. And so this is a Guilford freight in Portsmouth. Guilford renamed itself Pan Am Railways in 2007. And then just a couple of years ago, Pan Am was bought out by CSX Transportation, which is the largest freight company on the East Coast. But this is more of a recent shot of the freight business in Portsmouth Yard. As you can see over the years, the maintenance of the yard has kind of gone down a little bit. In recent years, they put a lot of money into renovating the tracks in the area. So things are a little better now than they were in the 90s, for sure. Another thing that we'll talk about is the Navy Yard across the river in Kfoury. They ship out fuel rods from submarines by rail, and so you can see a container for that traffic on the very end of the train. We'll get into the eastern route now. So as I said earlier, the eastern route was the #1 artery in the city of Portsmouth. Construction began way back in 1837, about 60 years after the end of the American Revolution, and then was completed in 1840 as a through route between Boston and Portland. The Boston and Maine had complete control by 1890, and then in 1952 they abandoned the eastern route from Kfoury to Portland, except for a couple small segments. And as we said earlier, passenger service ends in 1965. Later on, the line from Portsmouth south to Salisbury was renamed the Hampton Branch, and that portion of the eastern route was still seeing freight trains till about 2008. It's now been converted into a rail trail. Another shot, you can see the eastern route in red, where it comes through the city and then curves across the river in the state of Maine. Particularly nice shot, looking back towards Portsmouth Station. You can see the eastern route. This was taken in 1963. That siding that goes off to the right went down into the area where the art space is today. And some of that track is actually still there in the woods because there's a siding that serves some industries back there. 3S art space. And looking in the opposite direction, you can see the spur which went downtown to serve a couple industries serving off to the right, and the eastern route main line swinging off to the left. The eastern route crossed the river on the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge on the lower level of the bridge, as you can see here. Freight train heading to Kfoury on the lower section of the Long Bridge. This bridge was built in 1939 to replace an earlier bridge that you'll see in just a second. And there's the earlier bridge. This is the original bridge that carried the railroad from its construction in the 1840s right up until the 1930s. It was kind of a rickety affair by the 1930s, as you can see here. Originally, it had carried the railroad on one side and horse and buggy on the other side, but by the 1930s was only being used by trains at extremely low speeds crossing the river from Kfoury into Portsmouth. Now, this bridge specifically is responsible for one of the most famous rail accidents in Portsmouth and Kfoury's history. 1939, they were building the brand new Sarah Mildred Long Bridge, and you can see that construction happening alongside the original wooden bridge. Now take a look at this wooden bridge and how it kind of goes up and down again as it heads into Kfoury. While they were building this bridge, a caisson from the construction of the new bridge found its way over to a support beam on the old bridge, and a cable loosened a support beam on the old wooden bridge. And on September 10th, 1939, Boston and Maine passenger train number 2020 was heading from North Berwick to Boston with 12 passengers and 5 crew. At 7:10, we started off across the old wooden bridge, got part way over the old bridge, and then the bridge gave way. The locomotive, the coal tender, and the first car went into the river. Thankfully, the automatic air brakes kicked in, and the other passenger cars stayed on the bridge. There were no passengers in the first car, although the engineer and firemen went into the water and later were found having drowned after the locomotive went into the water. And you can see the section of the bridge which collapsed and dropped that engine and that first car into the river. You can see too just how close it was to the construction of the new bridge. They sent a diver into the water. You can see an old style diver there coming out of the water. They determined that it was going to be too difficult to raise the locomotive up, and so for the last 80 plus years, number 3666 has been at the bottom of the river. And you can see, there it is. Right here, the locomotive and the coal tender. Now this is the original Sarah Mildred Long Bridge, which was replaced just a couple of years ago, and when they put the new bridge in, the new bridge is a lot closer to where the locomotive was lying. And so they actually dredged, they moved the locomotive. And when they did that, they raised up some parts from 3666. Specifically, I believe these are the pilot wheels, and maybe one of the tender trucks. And they actually put some of this on display at the Kfoury Naval Museum and Albacore Park, and so you can go see a piece of one of 6 remaining Boston and Maine steam locomotives that still survive to this day. At the bottom of the Piscataqua River. Although it is interesting though, if you go on YouTube and look up, there have been divers that have gone down to it, and there is some very clear footage of number 3666 where you can very clearly see the drive wheels themselves. It's upside down, but it looks surprisingly similar to the way it did the day that it went down to the bottom of the river. So, pretty interesting. That will always be a part of Portsmouth's history.
Sir?
Yeah?
I dove it in 2000.
Oh, yeah?
It was extremely easy to tell what it was.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny when we talk about railroad preservation, people are always lamenting how many steam locomotives were scrapped in the 50s and early 60s and how many steam engines we lost. And particularly interesting that this is the only example of a P2 Pacific that still exists in the world, and it is still here. It's just at the bottom. You can see that when the new bridge was built, this is how passenger trains from Boston to Portland would have gone across the river, a lot safer on the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge. Of course, this bridge was later replaced, and the new bridge does have rail underneath it. However, it's not a separate section like it was. You have road traffic and train traffic going at the same time. The new bridge, the road section has rails in the pavement, and so when a train needs to cross, no cars can go over the bridge. So,
It's very, very cool.
very. Some of these guys in the front row have been over there by train, and it's pretty different. This is probably early 1950s. This is a passenger train with a diesel locomotive crossing the river back into Portsmouth from Kittery. On the far side of the river was the junction between the Eastern Route main line and the York Harbor and Beach branch. And the Eastern Route went under the road in a tunnel and then continued off towards Portland. The York Harbor and Beach branch, which no longer went to York after the 1920s, was used to serve freight customers in Kittery and is still used today to serve the Navy Yard. This is the end of track on the York branch. Probably in the 1960s, early 1960s, they were still spotting cars of coal for coal dealers in Kfoury. And 1960s, Portsmouth switcher, I assume this is bringing up some memories. Portsmouth switcher is going back to Portsmouth, coming back from serving a customer over in Kfoury. And here's the picture you probably saw in the marketing of the presentation. This is the 1980s. This is the Portsmouth switcher, which is going to probably go into the Navy Yard. A really cool look at how that train traffic and the road traffic kind of coexisted there in Portsmouth and Kittery. Now, south of Portsmouth, the Eastern Route went through Hampton, and this is the Hampton Marshes, where the Eastern Route traveled between Portsmouth and what's now the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant. These tracks are still actually there today. I haven't seen a train since late 1970s, early 1980s. And there's some places where the erosion is starting to eat away at where the tracks are. At some point, they may make this into a trail. I'm not sure how that's going to coexist with the nuclear plant, but you can see there was a freight house there in Hampton, in the marshes, which did receive some freight service into the 1960s. The Boston and Maine ran their Portsmouth switcher as far as Salisbury so they could serve the Amesbury branch, which went out to Amesbury, Massachusetts, and that was last used in 1972. In the late 1970s, the building of the Seabrook nuclear power plant saw a resurgence of train traffic from Portsmouth south to Hampton on the Hampton branch, which had once been the Eastern Route main line. And so this is a train of ballast hoppers, which is coming back from the nuclear plant site. They built a little railroad yard at the nuclear plant so they could unload materials while they were building it. Hampton Depot and the Eastern Route looks a lot better today. The station's been restored and renovated. The tracks were removed about 2013. Last freight trains to Hampton would have been about 2008. Another Boston, Maine local freight heading north on the Eastern Route in the Hampton branch. I don't know if this freight house is still there in Hampton. It was last time I looked, but I think it's in pretty rough shape. A couple of freight industries in Hampton. This is the Cahill Lumber Yard, which was a big lumber dealer in Hampton. They got a lot of rail service until early 2000s, I believe. And Foss Manufacturing, which was the very last freight customer on the Hampton branch. They last got their freight in 2008, and then the tracks were abandoned. These were hoppers of plastic pellets, and they would pump the pellets out of the hoppers using these pipes into the building. One of the most interesting railroad lines in Portsmouth was the Dover in Portsmouth. Of course, it was built to connect those two cities, opened in 1874. Didn't last all that long. Through train service between Dover and Portsmouth ended in 1936, and the Boston and Maine was still using the track from Dover to Dover Point until March 1938, but the bridge across the river was no longer in service. That connection was abandoned in 1941 between South Dover, Sawyers, and Dover Point. The Boston Maine was still serving South Dover until the 1980s. And then the line from Portsmouth to Newington remained in service because there was a large number of freight customers along that track. And so here's downtown Portsmouth down here. This is where the bridge was that connected Bloody Point and Dover Point. The reason they kept the Newington industrial track, as it would later become known, in service was because there was a bunch of freight customers, and there still are several along this stretch. There was also a spur which was constructed to cross the turnpike with a grade crossing and go into the Air Force Base, Pease Air Force Base. And they ran freight and government equipment into the Air Force Base probably into the late 70s, early 80s. Bloody Point is the point where the railroad crossed the river into Dover Point. You can just see that bridge here behind the toll house. This toll house and railroad station is actually still there today. I think it's on the list of buildings that should be preserved and saved, so hopefully that'll get some attention. There it is in later years. Similar to how it looks today. This is the spot where the Eastern Route main line to the right diverged from the Newington Industrial or the Dover and Portsmouth. And this track to the right then would have gone underneath the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge, which you can just see right here. The milepost tells you that Dover is 11 miles away. Really, really cool shot in the mid-1960s of a freight going up the Newington Industrial track. And you can just see the construction for the Route 95 bridge is starting to take place in the background. So not quite completed yet at this point.
What year was that?
This is probably 1967-ish. We have some pictures later in the presentation of some materials for the bridge construction, which came into Portsmouth, so probably 67, 68, thereabouts. Cool shot from the 1980s of the wooden trestle on the Newington Industrial and the Sarah Mildred in the background. It's hard to get a picture of this bridge today because the new Sarah Mildred Bridge pretty much goes like right over where this trestle is today. And another neat shot from the 1980s. Now, probably my favorite railroad line of all time is the Portsmouth branch. I lived in Raymond for a couple years, one of the towns that the Portsmouth branch passed through. Unfortunately, I was born about 13 years after the train stopped running. But it was really cool to be able to walk the right of way and see where a lot of these things had happened. The Portsmouth branch was built between 1847 and 1852 as the Portsmouth and Concord Railroad. Originally, it ran through Hooksett and Suncook to reach Concord. But in 1862, pretty early, they changed that. They abandoned the tracks between Candia and Suncook and built a new alignment down to Manchester instead. And so by 1895, this line from Manchester to Portsmouth was operated by the Boston and Maine. In 1982, the Boston and Maine abandoned the line from East Manchester to Rockingham Junction, but today the Portsmouth branch from Rockingham Junction to Portsmouth is the very last rail access Portsmouth has to the outside world. Surprisingly enough, you'd think maybe the eastern route would have lasted longer, but actually it was the Portsmouth branch which gave the Boston and Maine its connection. Here you can see in orange the Portsmouth branch where it leaves Portsmouth, crosses a road in Greenland, and then heads along Great Bay out to Rockingham Junction, which is right on the border of Newmarket and Newfields. This is the eastern route in red, and this is the western route in purple. The western route, of course, is still used today by the Downeaster and all the big freight trains that go from Boston, the Boston area to Portland. You can also see why the Boston and Maine got rid of the eastern route, because it was that much closer to the western route, which had a lot more traffic than the eastern route. Rockingham Junction is the point where the Portsmouth branch crossed over the western route and then continued onwards through Epping, Raymond, Candia, Auburn to Manchester. This is the section that was abandoned in 1982, everything west of Rockingham Junction. And they kept Rockingham in service so they could still send freight trains into Portsmouth. Late 1940s, that same train you saw with the boat on it earlier is heading out on the Portsmouth branch. This was called Emery, the spot where the Portsmouth branch and the eastern route main line separated from each other.
We still call it that.
You still call it Emery. Is there a sign there still?
Yes.
Another Portsmouth branch freight heading out on the branch here, once again, probably about the late 1940s, early 1950s. Then the Portsmouth branch heads through Greenland and goes under Route 95, which would become Route 95, and crosses the main road in Greenland. Kind of a long straightaway there from Greenland back towards the hospital in Emery. Greenland Station, still there today, kind of a classic Boston and Maine passenger station. And Epping. Now Epping, New Hampshire is interesting because Epping was the place where the Portsmouth branch crossed over another main line, the Worcester-Portsmouth main line. These are cool shots. In particular, these were taken probably about 1955 because they show the Portsmouth branch freight. But if you look at the very end, you can see a passenger train. The Boston and Maine canceled their regular passenger service between Concord and Portsmouth in 1954, but the state of New Hampshire said they still had an obligation to carry passengers. And so the solution for that was the Boston and Maine took an old wooden passenger combine coach and slapped it on the end of the freight train. We have it on pretty good authority that not many regular passengers actually rode the mixed train, but a lot of rail fans did. And so we have a lot of photographs of the mixed train. Very, very cool bit of history too. This exact same coach still exists at the Strasburg Railroad in Pennsylvania. And you can buy it. And so a couple years ago, a friend of mine went down the road behind a steam locomotive in this very same coach, and I stood right in the window here. It was very neat because that went right through my hometown of Greenland quite a bit between 1954 and 1960. And a classic shot of Rockingham Junction. You can see this is the Portsmouth branch looking towards Manchester. Here you have the western route main line, Boston to the left, Portland to the right. You have a maintenance away shack, a speeder shed, the freight house, and a Rockingham Junction station. And that wooden combine coach right on the rear of the local freight. The Rockingham station was just relocated. It was pushed back quite a ways. It's been altered considerably from its original appearance, but it is still there today.
So is that down the Newmarket Rail Trail?
Yeah. So that line from about where the boxcar is to Manchester is the Rockingham Rail Trail.
Yeah.
And everything you see here, well, not this exact section, but is still used by the railroad to reach Portsmouth. Epping, New Hampshire, this is Route 125 here. This is the Manchester freight coming back from Portsmouth. Only have tanker cars of bunker C fuel oil on this day. Throughout the 1960s, the car count on the Manchester and Portsmouth freights was large enough that they often required 2 diesel locomotives, which is pretty incredible. Same spot, different day. Some different freight on there as well as all those tanker cars. And looking towards Portsmouth with Route 125. Route 125, of course, a little bit smaller than it is today. Kind of a neat shot too in the background. You can see some bricks from the W.S. Goodrich Brickyard, which is a major industry in Epping. And today that whole area is the shopping center that has the Walmart and all of it. But bricks in particular was a huge industry for the town of Epping into the 1970s and 80s. This is probably about 1967, 1968. The local freight still has a good amount of freight cars on it. Portsmouth branch crosses Great Bay and Stratham. And so you can see the local freight coming from Manchester heading to Portsmouth behind us. And on the train are some of those girders that would be used to build the Route 95 bridge. The Portsmouth branch was special because it didn't have any overhead height restrictions. There were no high bridges or anything of that nature on the Portsmouth branch. And so the Portsmouth branch was used extremely frequently for heavy, bulky loads which traveled from Manchester to the seacoast. And you'll see more of that in the presentation. And some of those girders for the Route 95 bridge. Bit of an upgrade here. You can see the rails kind of rising in the background as they head towards Portsmouth from Stratham. And the Manchester local freight in Portsmouth Yard. Again, you can see how many tracks were necessary in the 1960s, even for the freight as the business started to drop away from the railroads in the 60s. By the 1970s, the Portsmouth branch between Manchester and Rockingham Junction was beginning to see a lot of decline. There was a lot of growth and brush encroaching on the tracks, and oftentimes the local freight out of Manchester would only go as far as Epping with a single freight car. And so here they are in Epping in the late 1970s rather, with a single boxcar of feed from Merrimack Farmers Exchange. And so you can see why in 1982 the Boston, Maine would abandon the branch from Manchester to Rockingham Junction. There just wasn't the business to justify maintaining the tracks. But it was still important because there was a lot of heavy, wide, bulky freight that needed to come over the line, particularly in the 1970s. These pipes are eventually bound for the Seabrook nuclear power plant. This is Route 125 in Epping, local freight heading towards Portsmouth. So even that late in the game, that section of the Portsmouth branch still had a pretty important role to play. Down in Portsmouth Yard, more freight for Seabrook. And eventually, in 1982, as we said, the Boston and Maine abandoned the tracks from Manchester to Rockingham. This is right past Route 125 in Epping. They started to pull the tracks up. Today, this is the Rockingham Rail Trail through Epping. Greenland, as I said earlier, the branch from Rockingham Junction to Portsmouth was still necessary to bring freight into Portsmouth. And so we have Boston and Maine freight in the late 1970s coming into Portsmouth by way of Greenland and Rockingham Junction.
What was that customer on the right?
Customer on the right was Sylvania, in that shop, where that shopping plaza is today.
Oh, yeah.
They got hopper cars of sand, I believe. So today, as we've seen today, quite a bit of Portsmouth's railroad history has disappeared. This is the railroad map as we have it today. The eastern route is gone, the Hampton branch is gone. The Portsmouth branch in red still comes into Portsmouth Yard. The old Dover in Portsmouth is in service as the Newington Industrial Track. And then crossing the river into Kittery, we have what's left of the old York Harbor and Beach line, which is used to serve the Navy Yard. In recent years, the railroad has sort of seen some revitalization efforts in Portsmouth, particularly when CSX Transportation purchased the railroad a couple of years ago. They pumped a lot of money into rebuilding Portsmouth Yard and the branch to Rockingham Junction. There's still a number of freight customers in service in Portsmouth today. This is Highlander Foods. They still receive freight service. This is a couple of years ago. These pictures I took maybe 9 or 10 years ago, so they're not super recent, but they show a little bit more of a modern look at the railroad in Portsmouth. Highlander receives refrigerated boxcars, and so a couple of reefers here behind the diesel locomotive. That's the hospital, I think, in the background there. This is Emory, so I'm standing on the old eastern route, Hampton branch. You can see there's still a little bit of track there in the brush. And this is the Portsmouth branch. If you remember those shots of those steam locomotives curving away, exact same location, just in the modern day. Another shot of the junction there. Everything behind where I'm standing is the rail trail now. In addition to Highlander Foods, Boise Cascade gets lumber in Portsmouth. C3 is probably one of the more prominent customers. They receive propane tankers by rail, and they're actually quite busy. And then Tyco, which is now known as Subcom, I believe, receives carloads of plastic pellets. And so, in addition to the Navy Yard, which still sees occasional rail service, there's a healthy amount of customers in Portsmouth today. Portsmouth Yard, if you can remember the shots of diesel engines and the steam engines and all the signals and the water standpipe and the engine facility. Not exactly the same today, but for a location in New Hampshire, still quite a prominent rail location, getting a decent amount of freight service today, which is a lot different compared to some other places. A couple shots of what Portsmouth Yard looks like today. There has been a little bit of tension between the railroad and some of the tenants in some of the houses nearby. This is what happens in New England, specifically an area that doesn't have a lot of land to deal with when that industrial land loses its industrial purposes and gets repurposed for residential housing. You do have a place that was not originally meant to house people coming up right against what is still active rail yard. And I do believe that CSX has made some inroads in kind of negotiating and dealing with some of that tension a little bit. They keep the engines stored at Rockingham Junction now instead of Portsmouth, so there isn't idling and noise and things like that. So just finding a way to deal as New England and the landscape of New England goes further away from the railroads and the industry, how these parties and groups can kind of coexist, which still allows all these things to happen. So very interesting.
There's a guy that lives next to the switch for Boise that likes to yell at us.
Oh, I've heard about
every time we
that.
serve them.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially in a place like Portsmouth, which had its origins in the seaport industry and then saw it transfer into the railroad industry and then eventually transfer into a bedroom community in a lot of ways for a lot of parts of New Hampshire and New England. So that landscape keeps changing and it's very interesting to follow it as it happens. A couple of years ago, Pan Am Railways, the successor eventually to the Boston and Maine, ran their office train to Portsmouth, and so we got the chance to see some 1950s vintage passenger engines and some passenger coaches in downtown Portsmouth. And if you squint, it kind of reminds you of some of those passenger trains which came down the Eastern Route from Portland to Boston. So very interesting today that Portsmouth has maintained its shipping and railroad history, and that sort of story is being perpetuated further in the future. And closing with a couple more shots here at Emory, the junction between the Portsmouth branch and the Eastern Route main line.
Where is Emory?
So Emory would be, I'm trying to think about, near Barbary Lane, right about there.
Say it again.
Barbary Lane,
Okay.
off of Islington Street. Yep. Right in that general area is where you can access the rail trail and you can still see where the junction is located.
Used to be like a flag stop, I think, at one
Oh,
time.
yeah, flag stop there for passenger trains.
Yeah, I remember seeing a picture of Michelle over there.
Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for coming. One little quick bit of information before I close here. I'm part of the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. Our whole purpose is to keep this history relevant moving into the future. We have an archive location in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is located in the National Park Library. So you can go down there and dig through our photos, our records, maps, engineering documents. All of that is accessible with an appointment with the National Park. We also have a website, bmrrhs.org. You can join us as a member. We have a YouTube channel where we make videos about history. We actually have made one about Portsmouth. I have some cards here which have a QR code which will bring you directly to the YouTube channel, or you can just search Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society and you'll find us. But if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them for you. But thank you so much for coming.